Dragon Quest, called Dragon Warrior when I got the free copy with my Nintendo Power in 1990, was the second JRPG I ever played at the impressionable age of 8. And, if you've watched even just a few of my videos, it obviously became the first game in a series against which I would, and still to a great degree, measure and compare every other JRPG against. With Satoru Iwata's help, Dragon Quest actually released in the West in 1989, and at my young age, it was completely unclear to me just how great the Dragon Quest series would become. Admittedly, while I was enamored with the game, it honestly didn't wow me as much as Nintendo's Mario, Zelda, and even Square's Final Fantasy, which was the first JRPG I ever played, did at the time. Also, by the time I played the game, Japan had already just released Dragon Quest IV in Japan. The first 3 games of the Dragon Quest series would later become known as the Roto Trilogy in Japan, or Erdrick Trilogy in the West, named so after the original storied hero of the games. Admittedly, in my 8-year-old eyes that judged games more by their graphics than their gameplay, the 3 and 4 year delays definitely didn't help the Dragon Quest series stand out much against most other NES games or even SNES games I was playing at the time. Nowadays, it's much easier for me to distinguish between an unpolished gem and a polished turd, and I value gameplay over graphics. For reference, the West didn't get Dragon Warrior 2 until 1990, and Dragon Warrior 3 arrived in 1992, meaning it was an NES game competing with a graphically superior Final Fantasy IV, named Final Fantasy II in the West on the Super Nintendo. As you can probably imagine, the Dragon Warrior series being so behind the Final Fantasy series in graphics due to slow localization definitely affected Dragon Quest sales in the West adversely. I played through the Dragon Quest games to completion, either through multiple rentals at Blockbuster Video or simply trading games with my friends. However, I didn't start really appreciating Dragon Quest's brilliance until the release of Dragon Quest IV just a few months after Dragon Quest III came west, and Dragon Quest IV became my favorite game in the Dragon Quest series. The game is still on my JRPG top 10 list to this day, and my love for the game is probably why I have such a huge crush on other games with omnibus storytelling like the Octopath Traveler series, Saga Frontier, and Live Alive. It was sometime shortly after I completed Dragon Quest IV for the first time that I went back and played through Dragon Quest 1 through 3 again, and while Dragon Quest 1 and 2 still didn't wow me, Dragon Quest 3 had me under its spell. I was a little older replaying these games of course, but it was Dragon Quest 3's job system that had me coming back to the game, trying out different party combinations in subsequent playthroughs and working towards classing up into the powerful Sage class. While my respect for the Dragon Quest series grew considerably since then, it wasn't until around Dragon Quest VIII, when the graphical advantage Final Fantasy had over the Dragon Quest series shrank considerably and certain important changes were made to the Dragon Quest formula, that I started to seriously think the game series was poised to break out in popularity and sales in the West. Things like random encounters were holding the game back from the mainstream for a lot of people, and these things were later addressed, but that's outside the scope of the Erdrick Trilogy. As for the Erdrick Trilogy and Dragon Quest as a whole, it all began when game designer Yuji Horii, mangaka Akira Toriyama, and composer Koichi Sugiyama created Dragon Quest I. Yuji Horii had already been recognized by Enix for his talent in creating games. Akira Toriyama had just created the Dragon Ball manga series 2 years prior, which was still years away from when it would become a legend in the manga and anime scene worldwide, to say nothing about his work on video games like Chrono Trigger and the rest of the flagship Dragon Quest series as well in the future. Koichi Sugiyama was already a celebrity and classically trained musician in Japan before he composed for the Dragon Quest games. Needless to say, the talent behind Dragon Quest was incredible from the beginning, and this team would continue to define the world of Dragon Quest until the death of Koichi Sugiyama and Akira Toriyama after the release of Dragon Quest XI. The Erdrick Trilogy games in the Dragon Quest series were actually developed by Spike Chunsoft, who went on to create Dragon Quest's highly successful spin-off series Mysterious Dungeon featuring Torneko or Taloon from Dragon Quest IV. Spike Chunsoft still develops the Mysterious Dungeon series, and it is known these days as Shiden the Wanderer. Anyways, Dragon Quest was intentionally developed to be a very simple game to play. It took wizardry's complexities and choices and eliminated them to the point where players only needed to worry about updating the equipment on their sole party member and fighting enough battles to get strong enough to proceed to the next part of the game. The game also borrowed overworld traversal features from Ultima in its design, giving it a more epic scope than wizardry's Soul Dungeon. Dragon Quest's charm was in its simplicity, which meant literally anybody could play the game and understand it, unlike, say, the more complex Western RPGs like Wizardry or Dungeons & Dragons. The computer did all of the damage and defense calculations for the player, and removed the need for players to roll stats and create a character. Whether players would find the simple process of grinding golden experience fun or not was another matter, but simplifying the RPG like this had one more big advantage. Yuji Horii could tell a more compelling story since he controlled the variables surrounding the main character's identity. By making the protagonist silent, players could insert their own imaginations into how the character handled things as events played out in the story. In addition to the story, players could also find useful items and equipment in caves and dungeons or buy them in stores. Certain story elements could even be completely completely skipped, like rescuing the princess before defeating the Dragon Lord. The game was technically an open world, but realistically, a level 1 hero would get destroyed before they could get far after crossing a bridge or wandering too far from home at the beginning of the game. This mostly forced players to grind to proceed with the game, but a knowledgeable player could still do cool things like find strong weapons and armor early in the game if they knew where to search or how to manipulate the game's RNG. The hero's stat growth was actually tied to whatever the player named their hero at the beginning of the game, too. The hero could learn offensive spells like Hurt and Hurt More, debuff spells like Illusion, and standard healing spells with level ups earned by gaining experience from defeating enemies. To save the game, players would have to speak with the king in the first castle, Tenteagle. Dying resulted in losing half your gold and returning to the king. The game's English localization style featured an old Shakespearean-style English that confused the heck out of me when I was 8 years old, but I can respect a lot now since it really did give the game a flavor no other JRPG had. Dragon Quest has been remade multiple times for future platforms. The game initially suffered low sales, but with some help from Yuji Horii advertising the game in Shonen Jump, Akira Toriyama's art, and Koichi Sugiyama's incredible soundtrack for 1987, the game ended up selling an astounding 1.5 million copies in Japan, with 1 million of those sales occurring in the first 6 months after its launch. The Western version of the game removed the password save system in favor of a battery backup. The title of the game was changed to Dragon Warrior to avoid copyright issues, a change that would remain for series releases until the release of Dragon Quest VIII in the West many years later. The box art was changed from Akira Toriyama's art to more Western-styled art. It's hard to believe anyone would want to change Akira Toriyama's art these days with how famous Dragon Ball became, but he was unknown outside Japan at this time. It wasn't until Dragon Quest VII in the West where we would see Akira Toriyama's art on the box for a Dragon Quest game in the West. Dragon Quest II made several interesting changes to the Dragon Quest formula. Instead of playing as a sole adventurer, you eventually controlled a party of 3 characters that had their own unique characteristics. Also, instead of Dragon Warrior's one-on-one battles, Dragon Warrior 2 could have groups of monsters in an encounter. Also, unlike Dragon Quest, which had one location to save, players could save in several locations through ministers or kings. Players would also eventually get access to a boat, which would let them explore the world in an open-ended manner. There were also more spells and items in the game, and all the playable characters had their own inventories. Dragon Quest II's famous Cave to Roan, which gave my sweet innocent young mind nightmares, featured a design that was inspired by the classic trick to exit mazes by always moving forward while sticking to the right-hand side wall to avoid traps. Akira Toriyama painted the monsters first, and the development team translated his images into the game. Yuji Horii followed a pattern similar to manga and film creators, quickly outlining the story's plot in his mind and then creating the physical shape of places on blank paper, before finally creating the key elements and story at the end. Yuji Horii's friend Hiroshi Miyaoka mainly wrote the scenarios for the game, and yes, this is the same Hiroshi Miyaoka who created the Metal Max series I'm obsessed with and have gushed about in multiple videos I've linked to in the description section below. If you love classic Dragon Quest as much as I do, and especially if you love science fiction, I highly recommend playing Metal Max 1 through 3 in English if emulation doesn't offend you. Anyways, Dragon Quest II had several setbacks in development. A lot of the programmers were students, and the programming lead had no experience leading a team, so the game was initially too difficult. Changes had to be made by reducing enemy counts in groups for the early game, and things had to be cut from the game to fit on a Famicom cartridge. Some of these things appeared in later remakes of the game, and in future Dragon Quest titles. Only 10 bytes of free space remained on the Famicom cartridge when development on the game was complete. Dragon Quest II had an album released, Dragon Quest II, Sweet Dragon Quest II, Gods of the Evil Spirits, released in August 20, 1987. In addition to 10 orchestral tracks, it also had a 25-minute original sound story. A concert recording from later that year also released as a symphonic suite CD titled Dragon Quest in Concert. Dragon Quest II music was also released as a piano CD, a drama CD, and several symphonic suite albums. Dragon Quest II's music has also featured in future albums as part of compilations as well. This song, Only Lonely Boy, was played as BGM on the game's password entry screen that only appeared in the game's Japanese version, as the Western version used battery backup saves like the Western version of the first game. Only Lonely Boy was also vocally arranged by Anna Makino and eventually became the fight song for Japan professional baseball team Chiba Lotte Marines. It's kind of amazing to see just how culturally huge Dragon Quest was even after just the second game, with a professional baseball team using arranged music from the game as a fight song. Several guidebooks for Dragon Quest II II were published by Shueisha and Tokuma Shoten in 1987. Enix produced an official guidebook in 1988. Dragon Quest II novel was written by Hideo Takayashiki and published in 1989. Dragon Quest Gamebook series was also published in 1989. The North American version of Dragon Quest II removed the stinky password system in favor of a battery backup. It added a storyline introduction in Moonbrook that wasn't present in the Japanese version. The game also started with an injured soldier from Moonbrook entering Maidenhall Castle seeking help. The coffins representing dead party members were replaced with ghost-like sprites in the Western version to avoid any controversy with religions popular in the West. The game sold 500,000 copies on its first release in Japan, which turned into 2.4 million copies by the end of the year. Super Famicom and Game Boy Color remakes sold 1.92 million copies worldwide. A mobile version in Japan was downloaded more than 1 million times. But the second Dragon Quest game was only the beginning of Dragon Quest's cultural dominance in the Japanese game market. Dragon Quest III expanded on this series' JRPG conventions even more, beginning with an even more open world than the first two Dragon Quest games. The game featured a new day-night system in which certain characters, quests, and items were accessible only during certain parts of the day. A monster arena in which players could place bets on AI-controlled monsters to potentially win gold was added to the game, as well as a bank where players could store money safely so as not to lose it after getting wiped. Players could also freely swap in and out party members. Dragon Quest III was the first game in the Dragon Quest series to incorporate a class system for companions that could be hired to accompany the hero on their adventure, and the player could choose to make the hero male or female. Only the hero had a part in Dragon Quest III's story, as the companions were hired to accompany them. The hero remained the hero class throughout the game and couldn't change classes, but the companions could level up their classes and eventually change them, which would let them keep spells they learned, half their stats, and level them back down to 1. This allowed players to customize their party to some extent, with fighters that could use magic or tankier magicians who gained levels in fighter classes first. The game also featured a powerful special class that couldn't be chosen at the beginning, but could be class changed into after meeting certain requirements. This class had decent stat growth and could learn both wizard and cleric spells. I remember the class system in the Nintendo version of Dragon Quest III to be neat and fun to play with, but it's actually more efficient, even if it is less fun, to just play through the game with a balanced party from the beginning and never change classes due to how long it took to grind characters back to high levels after class changes. You could exchange party members and store them at the tavern though, so some experimentation could be done with different classes. The original Famicom's base classes are Soldier, Fighter, Pilgrim, which I call Cleric, Wizard, Merchant, and Goof-Off, which I just call Jester. Dragon Quest III was actually my first exposure to a job-changing system in a JRPG, which made the game pretty special to me. By today's standards, there are much better class systems and even more modern JRPGs, including more modern Dragon Quest games that feel much more rewarding for engaging with them, but back then it was an addictive and amazing innovation for the Dragon Quest series and JRPGs in general the way it was implemented. I don't plan on spoiling the story to Dragon Quest III nor its relationship to Dragon Quests I and II, which I think was brilliantly put together for its time. But I will say the world design and setting of Dragon Quest III was really cool because it, in many ways, emulated the geography and history of real cultures and places on Earth. I was way too young when I played through the game to enjoy and appreciate this fact, though when I played through the game for the first time at 10 years old. Yuji Horii mentioned Dragon Quest III being the game where he perfected the series' game structure with its 4-member hero party structure. He also managed to remove the dreaded password save system from Dragon Quest III's Japanese release. While Dragon Quest III was an amazing game in its own right for its time in 1988, the real amazing thing about this game was its colossal sales numbers in Japan. The game set sales records for day one sales of 1.1 million units on its launch on February 10, 1988, and was responsible for almost 300 arrests for truancy among students absent from school to purchase the game. The sales hit 3 million units in just a week. Enix decided to release subsequent games in the series on weekends to prevent all the truancy arrests, and subsequent flagship releases in the Dragon Quest series have seen similarly high sales to Dragon Quest III. The game sold a comparatively stinky mere 95,000 units in the West, but it was released there 4 years later in 1992 when the 16-bit era had already arrived. Dragon Quest III was definitely the first breakout impactful JRPG as far as early sales acceleration, high sales numbers, and sales records overall in Japan. Squaresoft was able to sell more copies of Final Fantasy games in the West thanks to their faster localization speeds, but the Dragon Quest brand became the undisputed champion in Japan, and represented an ideal pursued by many companies trying to produce their own JRPGs in the late 80s and 90s. Even Chrono Trigger, a game many older JRPG enthusiasts like myself consider to be one of the greatest JRPGs of all time, lost in sales numbers to Dragon Quest VI when it launched the same year in Japan. But, go figure, Chrono Trigger also had the strength of Yuji Horii, Akira Toriyama, and Squaresoft's most talented and experienced developers behind it. And while the game's quality is still unprecedented to this day, its status as new IP meant it didn't get as many sales as Dragon Quest VI did during its time. Anyways, Dragon Quest III also saw numerous remakes with newer versions of the game adding new features like new job classes or becoming a little more user-friendly with its menus. The Nintendo version that was launched in North America in 1992 added a new title sequence and prologue to the game. The title sequence had a new music cue. Also, a new song was added that played after a certain character's death in the game. Dragon Quest IV music was added to the game for when players were starting a new game or loading back into a save game. And monsters in the Western version also dropped more golden experience. The Erdrick Trilogy experienced some censorship due to Nintendo of America's content guidelines at the time. The Puff Puff massage girls that appeared in the games were one such instance. The text was either changed or removed for the NES versions of the games. In later localized versions, this was changed to be closer to the Japanese games, and in modern titles, these are just gag scenes for players to appreciate. Dragon Quest III's male hero appears in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate as a guest character. A manga series, Dragon Quest Retsuden Roto no Monsho, translated Dragon Quest Saga Roto's Emblem, written by Chiaki Kawamata and Junji Koyanagi with artwork by Kamui Fujiwara, was published in Monthly Shonen Gangan from 1991 to 1997. It was later compiled by Enix into a 21-volume series. An anime movie based on this manga was released on videocassette in 1996. A sequel to this manga, called Dragon Quest Retsuden Roto no Monsho Monsho o Tsugumono Tachie, translated Dragon Quest Saga to the Children Who Inherit the Emblem, was published by Square Enix in 2005 and lasted all the way to 2019 with 33 volumes. The first 4 volumes were written by Jun Eishima, and the rest were written by Takashi Umemura. Artwork was done by Kamui Fujiwara, and Yuji Horii himself supervised all of it. The story of this manga was meant to take place after Dragon Quest III. So yeah, Dragon Quest III is huge in Japan. Most games I've talked about on this channel have mangas that last maybe a year at the most. This game has 2 mangas that lasted 6 years, and then another that went on for an astronomical 14 years. Like Dragon Quest II, Koichi Sugiyama's music for Dragon Quest III has been featured on all sorts of other compilation albums for the Dragon Quest series. And now, here in 2024, an incredible HD 2D remake of Dragon Quest III is set to release on November 14th, followed by HD 2D remakes of Dragon Quest I and II in the future, bringing the entire Erdrick Trilogy to modern platforms with a fresh coat of paint. And I am extremely eager to play these games, as I foregoed the remakes and haven't played the original game since I played the NES versions over 30 years ago. Dragon Quest III HD 2D seems to add a whole bunch of great menu UI features to the game that became standard in more modern Dragon Quest titles. It's adding an additional Monster Wrangler class that fits really well with modern Dragon Quest and expanding the role of monsters in the game beyond simply being enemies. The game's monster arena system is also revamped, with players being able to create their own team of monsters now like they could in Dragon Quest VIII and the Dragon Quest Monsters games. The character recruitment system has a lot more customization options, including personality types. Combat options can speed along easy encounters and still give players complete control for the more important battles. I know some of these things were added in past remakes of the game, but like I said, I only played the NES versions myself. Sure, Akira Toriyama's art is, I'll just say, changed a bit compared to the original, but the game seems like it's going to be fantastic for people like me to revisit. And it might even be fantastic enough with all the new features to even attract a new and growing audience of Western fans that became interested in Dragon Quest after playing games like Dragon Quest XI, Dragon Quest IX, and Dragon Quest VIII. I'm actually very curious to see how this HD 2D trilogy remake sells in the West, considering the popularity of the most recent flagship title, Dragon Quest XI, and its tie-ins with the Erdrick Trilogy. That's all I have to say specifically about the Erdrick Trilogy. Dragon Quest, spearheaded by games like Dragon Quest III, has had an incredible pop cultural influence in Japan that's bled over into their more internationally well-known anime, manga, and light novel culture. The whole hero and demon lord trope, played out in countless mediums and other games like Live Alive, came from Dragon Quest. Extraordinarily overpowered heroes in anime most likely were influenced by how strong heroes in the Dragon Quest series can get when they're shooting out lightning spells everywhere and crushing monsters at the end of the games. And if these tropes weren't in the style of Dragon Quest, they most certainly were in the style of wizardry, which was a main influence for even the original Dragon Quest. Given the age of Ichiban Kasuga and the Like a Dragon series of games, this trilogy is likely that character's motivation for his arc's numerous Dragon Quest references in its gameplay. Other JRPG developers frequently talked about how they try to make their games different to Dragon Quest in the 90s to differentiate them. The developers of early Final Fantasy titles even expressed admiration for how successful Yuji Horii was able to make the Dragon Quest series. Japanese athletes would mention how training is like playing a Dragon Quest game where they level up and improve their skills with experience. The Metal Max series of post-apocalyptic vehicular combat JRPGs borrow heavily from lessons the director Hiroshi Miyaoka learned from working with his friend Yuji Horii on the Erdrick Trilogy. Even the original Mother, or Earthbound Zero as it's localized in the West, Nintendo's first turn-based RPG on the Famicom preceding Earthbound explicitly mentions Dragon Quest in some NPC dialogue. I have a lot more to say about the Dragon Quest series as a whole, so much in fact that I'd like to dedicate a video to the entire series in the future. For now though, you'll have to settle for me name-dropping the game series or specific games in the series every time I'm trying to describe the gameplay of other JRPGs I talk about in most of my other videos. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.